Greg, I dare you to an angler off. If you don't edit the most amazing, most epic edit of our glorious savior, the anglerfish, I will send a cat your way.
No.
I am no heretic.
With the conclusion of the Alaskan War for oil resources and the Chinese pushed out of North America for the most part, everything would go eerily quiet all over the world, heralding in a much worse era. As world leaders fled to bunkers with the president going missing for weeks at a time, the average person had no idea what was about to happen, while the government leaders would hide from the issues that they created. That's crazy. That would never happen in real life. Eventually, the time would come on October 23rd, 2077, the nuclear bombs sent from China would begin falling all over the US. In return, the US would then fire its nukes at China, assumedly ensuring the same problem for them. As most Americans had already been exposed prior to constant nuclear warnings, many would actually ignore these sirens and be caught out in the open completely unaware. Some would survive by going into the vaults, the Pulaski preservation shelters, or even some cave systems. Really anywhere that they could escape the heat and shockwave brought on by the nuclear war. Those that managed to survive the initial blast would then find that a week later, Ray would move into the area that fell jet black due to the soot, ash, and other radioactive dust that had been spread all throughout the area. This being the other real threat to life. As this rain fell, it contaminated everything. It would last well over 4 days straight, as it would then land on animals, plants, and in general, everything that was on the ground, such as even microbes. Contaminating everything that may have been initially spared, many people would have to now contend with this highly radioactive substance landing on their skin. By this point, most of the Earth's surface would be sterilized, as plants would then bust back down to the status of needing a new pioneer species to begin the process of primary succession, typically relegated to just lichens and mosses. However, with the area drenched in constant nuclear radiation, this would require plants and animals to adapt in a way that is more in line with humanity's first attempt at genetically modifying food. Complete and utter random mutations induced in the genetic coding to see if anything would actually be viable. As this state would persist, many animals would begin to mutate within the crumbling cities and surrounding areas of the US, altering their original form and creating something much more monstrous than had ever existed previously. At this point, it was no longer just the radiation the average person had to deal with, but now the very fauna and anything associated with that fauna in the general location that they happen to be in. Essentially, everything would become hyper lethal and way more aggressive than they had previously been towards other animals or even humanity. Contending with all this, pockets of humanity continued to survive, but it was quite clear that human dominance over the area and civilization in general was well and truly dead. The harsh reality of the world that man had produced due to its resource mismanagement and inability to pivot away from oil in time had secured a wasteland that we now had to contend with or just go extinct. And if it could not get any worse, eventually mutations in humans began to crop up. The expected cancer rates would begin to soar due to random genetic mutations through indirect heating of the water that surrounded our genetic coding, and also the direct damage caused by gamma radiation directly striking the DNA, resulting in it ionizing, which then leads to cell death, mutation, or even neoplastic transformation. That last one being of great interest because that basically means cancer. So as time continued to pass in the shelters that people had that kept them alive, for some, they would be required to venture out as they did not have enough food and water necessary to stay there full time. Some would have taken shelter in sewers or subway systems, but obviously they would need to survive. Venturing out, they would be immediately exposed to the higher levels of ambient radiation 200 years ago. As they continued to drink the water and consume the animals that had collected all this radiation, it would just become a situation of eat today, think about it tomorrow. As the weeks passed, whether through indirect exposure or direct exposure, or possibly even just consuming animals, or maybe even, the nuclear bombs that had just dropped directly, people would begin to change genetically as much as they did physically. And this would result in those who survived the initial exposures to have developed what appeared to be large open wounds all over their body. Their voices would become raspy, and they would refer to everyone else as smooth skins, as they would slowly lose brain matter over time in the ensuing decades. They would ultimately be referred to as ghouls. So in today's episode, let's discuss biologically what is happening to their genetic coding after their exposure, why some appear to change while others just drop after their exposure, and ultimately what this means neurologically to go feral.
My mom used to...
But before moving on, I want to thank you guys for watching. Without you, none of this would even be possible, and I do appreciate your support. I'm streaming over on Twitch under the name Roanoke Games. We'll be live streaming on Roanoke Gaming for members. Gonna start something new, a watch party of the movie that I'll be covering that week. So check out Roanoke Tales also for cryptids and true crime stuff, and check out Discord where also we watch movies that end up here. Links for everything in the description. So first things first, let's start with the realist, where all good stories start from the beginning. But not the beginning, where we just talked about. I'm talking about the beginning of the beginning of the beginning. There's this misnomer that ghouls only originated from the nuclear fallout. Well, humanity is way more screwed at this point, and I mean, look at how the vaults came to be and what their entire purpose was, or even the shadow government residing within the government to determine how screwed society actually was. We truly do live in a society. The first ghouls to come about were actually prior to the war itself. It is not a complete unknown to the government that experimentation on humans maybe could help them survive nuclear radiation under very specific instances and if the right parameters were met. For specific individuals prior to the bombs falling, this medical experimentation conducted throughout the pre-war era would indicate that humans were actually able to survive what should be considered a lethal level of radiation. Somebody like Desmond Lockhart wanted to just extend his life indefinitely, so he was tested on, or he tested on himself. Eddie Winter being told that the end was nigh, and then his girlfriend kind of informed him of the right amount of radiation that could make him immortal, so he went along with that and then was turned. Another known as Peters, who was a control subject, she willingly underwent radiation exposure in hopes of developing a radiation treatment for what was coming. She was exposed to around 600 rads, and then they gave her a placebo serum to counteract the radiation. Pretty screwed, because given it was a placebo, it didn't work at all, and eventually she would devolve into a glowing feral one, or a glowing one who's feral, whatever. So there are many other examples of this happening either in vaults or robotic facilities, but essentially it highlighted that humans could survive what was considered to be lethal if the conditions were met just so. So after the bombs would fall from the sky, this test would take place on a massive scale. Millions of humans, because billions were vaporized, would be exposed to these high levels of radiation at varying rates. The first would actually arise in California, attempting to rebuild a society from a destroyed city that they called the necropolis, but that was eventually destroyed by super mutants. Spreading out across the area and coming up from their hiding places, it became apparent that at first, everyone just sort of regarded them as horrifically burned, or in general, maybe they're just injured. However, these burns did not seem to lead to their end. Instead, they continued to outlive regular humans and could survive in highly irradiated areas. So I think breaking in here to discuss burns and why they should be absolutely fascinating medically that they survived, that can be kind of explained here. When people think of burns, they just assume the issue to be a shock to the system from the destroyed skin, but the reality is it goes much deeper than that. When the skin is destroyed, that is a physical barrier removed from your body against the world around us. When the skin is degraded through burns and the more internal areas of the body are exposed, microbes can obviously easily move into the body and begin a massive infection. Also, your immune system just straight up does not work well after a burn. So given how close they are to the blood vessels at this point, this can lead to them entering these blood vessels and inducing septic shock. Along with this, body temperature regulation goes out the window, which will be important for today's discussion. Mass inflammation begins all over the body, leading to a catabolic state for the metabolism, which in turn can lead to organ failure. And along with all this, just our biggest hater, dehydration, becomes a real problem given that the body is absolutely hemorrhaging water because there's no barrier to retain it. Basically, when your skin is destroyed, literally everything is trying to kill you, including your own body. Interestingly though, sterilized fish skin has shown some promise in helping burns heal properly, which is fairly strange. So the people with these wounds didn't drop like a person normally would. It became clear that these people exposed to the radiation in this environment were not standard humans, and as a result, a divide began to form between the smooth skins and the ghouls. This would go as far as to suggest that these people were not actually people at all, but were some other form of species altogether. Because of this, they would be looked down upon, but ironically, ghouls were humans who had forced mutations that actually made them more fit for their environment. The old build of humans were not as well off in this new world and were holding on with bloody fingernails just trying to survive. Because of this, ghouls could inhabit areas that were absolutely lethal to regular humans, meaning that they were a product of this world. But it wouldn't be all sunshine and unicorn farts for the ghouls. Much like regular humans, their bodies would eventually degrade, leaving them aggressive and a real issue for anyone around them, which further upset the smooth skins by their presence. But before moving on to that discussion of degradation, let's first discuss what the mutations are that would lead them to be better off, though it may not look like it. When looking at a ghoul, the first thing you may notice is the body appears absolutely destroyed, but the reality is it's quite functional and working in a way that the environment requires it to be able to do to survive. In fact, almost every animal on the planet at this point, the ones that survive, look like this because functionally they are all ghouls. The ghoul mutation is not just central to humanity, but really any animal with a genetic coding can achieve it under very specific conditions. But what are these conditions? I have a conspiracy theory as to why some may turn when others really don't, and it's not rabies this time. So let's begin where we need to. Starting with the feet, we can see that they are in fact feet. Absolutely wild, right? The reality of the ghoulish physiology is not any different from the human form except for the absolutely atrocious level of apparent wounds. The ghoulish skin appears highly damaged with exposed muscle tissue to a degree, and in some cases, bones can be outright seen. However, mentally, the person is still quite intact, meaning that the wounds that are there are really just either really thin skin or it's gonna have to do more with their immune system being able to contend with the issues. We do know that ghouls are highly resistant to disease overall, but we'll kind of get there in a second. That said, these mutations will continue to run deeper, which we will discuss as we move along. Typically, you will find that the nose of a ghoul has been completely lost, and for the most part, the hair on the body is also gone. Now, it is possible to find some ghouls still having some hair, but there is a reason for this change as we look into these mutations. At its most basic level, we need to go down to the genetic level in order to understand what has happened to these people. When exposed, as mentioned previously, there are two forms of radiation damage to the DNA, indirect and direct. Indirect damage happens when the radiation itself will heat up the water within the cell, creating instability within the genetic coding. This is why tardigrades, for instance, are so good at surviving high radiation levels, as they can expel most of the water from their cells, causing indirect radiation damage to be way less effective at heating up their cells, and thusly, they do not have to worry about nucleic degradation. Direct radiation, on the other hand, is when radiation directly strikes the genetic coding, causing the backbone of the DNA to break, which in turn can lead to the cell to die because its information is disrupted and it no longer knows how to survive. It can also strike individual nucleotides, causing them to break off. These are more easily fixed if others are still there to kind of indicate the opposite match. Because humans lack this ability, like tardigrades have, to get rid of all the water in their body, when they are struck, the radiation causes a massive amount of damage to the human genome, then converting it possibly to a ghoulish genome. And those that would survive, they would find that their genes would be altered in several beneficial ways that may seemingly at first glance appear to be just straight up cancer. The first set of genes that would need to be altered by the radiation, which directly results in their appearance change, are the cyclin genes. Cyclin A and B, known as the G2 cyclins, are required for mitosis to even begin. Along with this, several other genes, BUB1, CDC20, HEC1, and the polo genes are relevant to the mix controlling various stages of mitosis, whether it be genome segregation, telomere production, or many other functions. With these genes broken, typically at this point, you become a cancerous mass because you're having your stuff is in your cells, divide way too much. The effect this would have on the ghouls is that their rate of healing through mitotic division would increase tremendously. It's important to remember, however, with mitotic division comes heat. It is actually stated that ghouls can feel radiation as literal heat, and they actually joke about if they're in low radiation environments or radiation environments where it's not even present, they may get frostbite. Now, they don't really get frostbite, they just feel cold, and this is a direct result of skin loss, skin damage, and the mitotic abilities they possess, and we'll kind of get there, but we need to kind of talk about the P51 gene first. The P51 gene is also known as the tumor suppression gene, and this gene acts as a transcriptional activator. What is that, I can hear you asking? Well, this basically means it controls the expression of other genes, so it is a regulatory gene, so to speak. When exposed to certain stimuli, such as elevated mitotic rate, for instance, it will induce cellular apoptosis. Basically says, hey, big dog, looks like you got too much dip on your chip with that dividing. Time to bite the big one. So as it explodes itself, this is very important because it stops you from becoming a tumor. Huge props to the P51 gene for being on team multicellular. Should this gene be altered in any other way, this can allow for cancer to ransack the body. Now, it should be known that there are many genes responsible for cell functionality, and it would ultimately be impossible to fit all of them in this video without sounding like a genetics textbook, which, believe it or not, you do not want that. That would be boring. But one in particular that I want to focus in on is the TGF beta protein complex. Now, TGF beta is it's a protein coded for genes or coded by genes like TGFB1, TGFB2, and TGFB3. Pretty easy to remember. Very original names. I know. But this is involved specifically with wound healing, or at least so much so that it has been identified. Its whole purpose is to promote collagen synthesis, cell proliferation, and scar formation. You can kind of see why I want to talk about this one. So to explain the ghoulish appearance, let me ask you something. Why do we scar? I mean, it's our skin. Why does it change to that level? Well, when you are formed during gestation, collagen would form a basket weave structure to support skin cells, which is why everything looks pretty uniform. Along with this, hair follicles formed as well, allowing for the skin to appear as it is, and also sweat glands. So when injured, this basket weave formation is not reformed. Instead, collagen fibers will run in one direction, making the skin less flexible and then alter its appearance greatly. Also, fun fact, if you ever develop scurvy for any particular reason, all of your scars will open back up. So this becomes a scar and hair follicle situation where, again, the hair follicles may or may not form correctly within the scar. The skin has functionally changed permanently, and we can see this displayed on the ghoul's physiology quite readily, as their skin is said to be scarred and quite leathery. With TGF-beta related genes altered, this may have caused collagen to go absolutely ham on them and then create this mass scar formation all over the body. And this in turn has led to the appearance that they had had. So because remember, radiation would have most definitely been destroying the skin, the body just mutated and responded by creating scar tissue at a massively accelerated rate. So going back to mitosis for a moment, this collagen production highlights how the underlying functions of their body are progressing. So with these genes altered, as such to deal with the environment being as hostile as it is, it's either heal or die. And when entering a highly radioactive environment, it's clear the ghouls can survive the radiation exposure, and this is likely due to the fact that the cells are actually dying off in droves, and this could be due to the fact that the P51 gene hasn't been switched off or wasn't destroyed, and may actually be operating at an increased capacity, or as I like to call it, kicking it into maximum overdrive. And when dealing with this environment, cancer would be the predominant issue. As a result, anything that has survived would have a much higher level of interventions naturally to deal with cells becoming cancerous. In fact, natural killer T cells, like we know ghouls in general are highly resistant to infections or any disease. They're not immune, but their immune systems are very clearly operating at a higher rate. NKT cells, or natural killer T cells, would be going around absolutely bodying cancer cells at this point, because it would be so prevalent that it's almost like dealing with the amount of microbes you deal with per day, except your body's just dealing with cancer per day. So it is known in humans that there is a syndrome actually called Laron syndrome, and this syndrome is quite rare, and it causes people to have decreased levels of IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor, which makes them incredibly resistant to cancer. I believe it to be more than just insulin-like growth factor at play here, but it also would require the P51 gene to behave more aggressively when dealing with possibly cancerous cells, and also the immune system is much more primed. And given the fact that their mitotic abilities are much higher than normal, it would not be a surprise to me if they just have naturally elevated levels of every type of immune cell possible just floating around their bodies all the time. And this is why they can have open wounds, and it's not really that big of a deal, because it's almost like macrophages. Typically, there's some spacing between macrophages within your bloodstream. Likely in this situation, as soon as a bacteria or virus enters the area, it just runs into a macrophage immediately, which then your body's like, hey, food's here. So that's how they remain so resistant to every infection. But one of the things we need to talk about is genetic stability. So as the P51 gene detects the cell has officially switched over to Team Cancer, much like the harshness of the environment, so too is the internal mechanisms of the body, equally harsh to survive. The cell is immediately destroyed, which is then detected as an injury. Mitosis of healthy cells are ramped up to heal the body, which the ghoul will then determine to be warmth, because the reason they feel cold in non-radioactive environments is because their body has nothing to heal, so heat loss through their degraded skin is like that of a burn victim. They quite literally need their healing ability to maintain thermal homeostasis due to their scarring and open wounds. However, this still calls into question genetic stability as a whole, and we have to ask, why did they survive when others turned into skeletons? Well, once again, you're not going to believe it, but I think this has to do with things completely outside of their control, and to understand that, we need to understand human longevity. Human longevity is the golden question surrounding everything. The fact that we only live about 80 years or so, give or take a decade or two, completely blows. Our brains are too smart for this, we understand too much of our own mortality, and this is totally lame. So as a result of that, we look for ways to increase our lifespan, mainly because we have no idea truly what happens after we take the big sleep for the final time. People will say with their whole chest that they believe that there is an afterlife, or they don't believe that there's an afterlife, but both of those require faith. Like, genuinely, if you ask for empirical data as much as like, oh, if you believe in God, okay, where's the empirical data? Well, it's based on faith. Okay, well, there is no afterlife. Okay, well, give me the empirical data on that. Oh, you can't. Okay, so it's faith that you just believe that there is nothing. I mean, it's basically the same thing either way, any way you slice it. One of them is, I don't know, the doomer, and the other is the Chad believer, I guess. I don't know. So Reddit mods incoming to tell me I'm wrong no matter what, but it doesn't really matter. So regardless of what you believe, there are factors surrounding those that have increased longevity, and the main one is, as always, genetic stability. Functionally, cells could actually be immortal. What's worse is, we know this. Aging and breaking down are known as entropy, or the gradual decline into disorder. As we age, our genes are assaulted by many factors and toxins that cause them to mutate, sometimes harmlessly, sometimes it's an immediate problem. Even as our cells divide, genetic coding is cut off, creating a ticking clock scenario, meaning that eventually our cells will run out of viable information to divide or even function, and will no longer be able to survive, which then leads to cell death. As these cells become more and more disjointed as we age, there's something known as the Hayflick limit, which says our cells can divide about 40 to 60 times before that cell line dies off. Eventually, our ability to fight infections decreases, and one way or another, we all die. It's an ass of a scenario, but again, it doesn't have to be this way. If we can figure out how to prevent genetic instability or even correct genes in older cells, we could be biologically immortal. In those who appear to have the most luck, the Centurions, I believe, are Centaurians. They're not centaurs, so it's not Centaurians. It must be Centurions. And I'm not talking about Roman Centurions or whatever. Basically, the people who live to be over 100 years old, we see they have a specific coenzyme at elevated levels. It's important to remember that we have found preserved brains also that are thousands of years old, meaning the brain doesn't just naturally degrade all by itself. It's been suggested that humans could technically live around 12,000 years if our bodies didn't give up the ghost so easily at the rate that they do. And most issues the brain actually runs into are direct results of the body failing to function as it should. So, enter nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or NAD+. This coenzyme is central to energy metabolism, but it also plays a key role in DNA repair, chromatin remodeling, and cell function in general. Healthy aging, as it's called, the higher amount of this specific coenzyme, the more it is typically you'll find gene stability in that person, and the older they can get. I believe this coenzyme would be instrumental in the formation of a ghoul, and it shows in everything that they do and how they operate, more so when they go feral. Now also, if you're interested in NAD+, I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but you can actually buy this stuff. Now, again, it's kind of a question of, is it really gonna help you to just have this floating around your cells? Is it not? Is it just related to a different variable? It's really hard to say, but you can actually go on Amazon and just buy this stuff. I take it as a supplement, just in case, you never know. And compared to my brother, who's only a year and a half older than me, I do look younger than him. Actually, both of them, so it is what it is. But the body can actually produce NAD+ through two main pathways, tryptophan and the salvage pathway that recycles components from vitamin B3 precursors. And this can be obtained from eating things like meat, fish, poultry, nuts, legumes, whole grains, and other fortified food, which also, fun fact, you know what enriched flour is? It's got something called thiamine mononitrate in it, because that makes it enriched and better for you. That's known to trigger migraines. Anyways, clearly in a post-nuclear world, they don't have much, so basically ghouls are going to be getting NAD+ from meat. But the big thing that I do want to point out is they can't smell or really taste, which is why ghouls can pretty much eat anything, and also they resort to cannibalism. But NAD+ playing this critical role in gene stability through the mechanism of DNA repair clearly indicates that the ghoul has or had elevated levels when exposed. This would protect their DNA from completely being destroyed, as still, even with this DNA repair, some genes would be destroyed or mutated. It also shouldn't be discounted that DNA polymerase, the gene associated with it, may have been mutated as well to somehow make it more effective at correcting gene errors. But in very specific instances, at very specific levels, the humans exposed would have a perfect balance of gene correction while also having some gene mutation become beneficial. Any more radiation, they would die. Any less radiation, the mutations may not have come on at all. And these mutations and the aforementioned genes would allow for a new form of human to arise and begin spreading out, more adapted and suited to this horrible world. However, this in turn wouldn't be 100% a good thing. Entropy, as always, is undefeated in the parking lot. Even our universe breaks down. So as the body can virtually heal from most damage, this would require the nervous system to still be functional within the ghoul. Given that the person's body has a higher ability to remain genetically stable in this hostile environment, and that their mitotic ability is also elevated, this allows for a ghoul to live much longer of a lifespan than a regular person. Some of the ghouls running around are from the pre-war era, which was over 200 years ago. However, this requires their nervous system to be intact and able to function at a higher level, or at least a human level. Over the years, it should be known that ghouls can still suffer genetic damage, and in turn, this would cause them to degrade. The brain is not when it comes to high levels of radiation, despite their healing ability, and as time passes, the genes of the neurons would be impacted as well. And this can happen for a multitude of reasons. It's important to remember that cellular mitosis requires nutrition. With elevated rates of mitosis, the body requires more nutrition to fuel this ability. When this is in short supply or the needs cannot be met, this will ultimately lead to the body decreasing in its ability to repair itself, allowing for the issues to begin building up. And this is why actually ghouls do have two ways of possibly dealing with this. The second way is not great, but the first way is essentially they go into a form of hibernation, which they'll basically enter a state of, hibernation in general, less metabolic activity, less stress on the body, until finally they can, deal with not having the food, and then they wake back up because food has presented itself, and then they can eat. However, the other way is really them turning feral, because you always find in areas where ghouls were separated out from everybody else and then left to their own devices for too long, they will go feral. So the neurons of the ghoul, again, they're not that much we know. When physical damage is incurred, they can be destroyed like any other neurons of any other animal. And this could take the shape of malnutrition, causing the body to produce components that are circulating in the bloodstream, inducing this damage. As enough time passes, the body will cannibalize itself for the most part, and this will lead to the brain beginning to degrade and ultimately to a process which is known as feralization. The feral ghoul is a human whose higher functions have begun to falter due to literal brain death. Still though, prior to any of this, I did want to discuss the raspy voice as it does relate to neurological issues. Essentially, it's important to know that this does highlight neurologically that something else is happening within the ghouls. The ghoul voice is husky, raspy, and sometimes a little hard to understand. Your voice is as much neurologically controlled as it is affected by actual damage or irritants to it. And it is known that certain neurological conditions, such as, what's his name, RFK? Yeah, Robert Kennedy, I think. If you hear his voice, that's actually a neurological condition. And this can cause the voice, not with RFK, but with the ghouls, to become more abrasive sounding. But I would also like to point out, given that the ghouls are eating and drinking in this environment, damage to the larynx is probably fairly prominent. While their healing ability does help to stave off these issues, this damage is then covered up with scar tissue, causing them to maintain this voice pretty much permanently at this point. So that said, eventually their voice will be lost to them, but this process is when they go completely feral. However, I believe that'll be reserved for part 2 when we talk about the ghoulification, which I know, it sounds like I'm straight up taking the word from Kyle Hill's video just a few months back, but it is written in the lore that ghoulification is the word. So, it's in the lore. Regardless, we will talk about the neurological degradation and why all of these things happen the way that they do really when we talk about the feralization. But in the meantime, I want to thank you guys for watching. We will continue on with our deep dive into the ghoulish biology next week. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Roanoke Tales, Roanoke Games, everything else, where I live stream in the description. But speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astronauts, Army and Tristan Kessick. Thank you guys. Next, I'd like to thank our astrophysicist, Des Dancer. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our scientists, Dakota 23, Invictus Echo, Metric System, Official Texan Stutz, and the victorious return of Chad the Enjoyer of Scientific Explanations of B-grade horror movies. And the rest of my patrons, you guys are absolute ballers. It keeps everything running smoothly, and I do appreciate it. All right, I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.